네, 그러면 이제부터 본격적으로 첫 순서 시작해 보도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 심포지엄의 첫 번째 순서는 케빈 러드 전
It's a special forum between Chairman Chung-in and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. We are providing simultaneous interpretation services for this forum. Please refer to the interpretation receipt.
한국어는 채널 그리고
Your channel to number 1 for Korean and channel 2 for English interpretation. To prevent the loss of items and to prevent the loss of the receivers, please remember to keep them at your seats. We will now begin right away. Chairman Chung-in will provide a 5-minute opening remark, followed by a video forum between Chairman Moon and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, after which the Chairman Moon will conclude with a 10-minute closing remark. We are broadcasting everything live via YouTube, so please remain at your seats. We will now invite Chairman Moon to the stage once again. I already provided opening remarks. President Yong-in Lee has invited former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd for a reason. The COVID-19 broke out and we are facing many economic difficulties, social So, because of COVID-19, if the economic depression is prolonged, this could lead to many precarious situations. And the global supply chain it may face many challenges due to the COVID-19 crisis. What is even more challenging is that in the past, as for the Ebola outbreak, the Obama administration had taken the lead and led a global coalition to fight the disease. However, the U.S., in the face of COVID-19, has become very debilitated, and it is not able to exercise international leadership in fighting the coronavirus. So many people are concerned about whether things will entirely change after COVID-19. A columnist even coined the term before COVID and post-COVID. So some people also point out, for instance, Dr. Kissinger says that because we are struck with COVID-19, national boundaries will be set up and countries may be isolated. Some others say that eventually the U.S. will claim victory and enter into a phase called Pax Americana II. Others remain pessimistic, nevertheless, pointing out that the U.S. domestic politics has been polarized and its economic engine is no longer there, and that Pax will be led by China instead of the United States. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd contends the following. Whether it be U.S. centrism or China centrism, neither can be an alternative, and that the entire world has to head toward multilateralism led by the United Nations, and it's called Pax Universalis. And Kevin Rudd says because U.S. and China are fighting against each other, he refers to the concept of the multilateral seven or the M7. M7 representing middle powers, and them leading the establishment of a new global order. Australia, Canada, the UK, France, Germany will comprise the M7 countries. Most of them are Western countries. Why is Korea not there? Well, he did say that Korea is probably a part of it if we recoin it as the M11. Nevertheless, I found that I personally don't think that the international order will undergo seismic shifts after COVID-19. I think competition between the US and China will continue. Of course, things could improve in a positive way where the two countries cooperate under the G2 system. And another possibility is where the relations between China and US deteriorates. That is what happened under the Trump administration, and that would lead to a new Cold War era order. So economic decoupling and technological hegemonic fight between the two countries, and the establishment of tech alliances to check China, and the possibility of a balanced alliance, and various thoughts and concepts are coming to the forefront. Otherwise, on the side of the US, because the US predicts that otherwise China will make things very difficult for the United States in the future. Last but not least, there could be continuation of the current status quo. Biden has been elected, and I don't think that the Biden administration would be as harsh as the Trump administration. But I think containment against China and checking China will continue under the Biden administration. Pompeo described China as a hostile state, but I don't think that will be the case under Biden. Of course, Biden will accept that the US and China are in rivalry, but the two countries have gone through phases where they have cooperated and phases where they have competed and phases where competition has intensified. Under the Trump administration, the hostility has risen between the US and China. While listening to the special forum, you will find out that Kevin Rudd presents a way for cooperation between the US and China. So we will be talking about various multilateralism comments. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 그럼 이어서 대담 영상 보시겠습니다.
Thank you very much. We will now begin.
Nice to see you.
Hi, nice seeing you again. Yeah. I
Hey,
saw
mate.
you on CNN
Yeah, I just
early
finished
this
on
morning.
CNN. Yeah, it's there's a lot going on in the world, my friend.
Would you just
Good.
go ahead for 10 minutes? Then I'll be asking a set of questions to you.
Yeah, that's fine. And the thrust of just to confirm, the thrust of the remarks you'd like me to make for 10 minutes, what would you like me to address again?
No, you can talk about, as you talked about at CNN, what is your take on the American president's election? And then you have
Okay,
written
good.
a lot on the so-called crisis of multilateralism. You talked about, multilateral 7 and etc. You can talk about the future of multilateralism, and also you're a specialist in China, and what would be the implications of change of leadership in the U.S. on U.S.-China relations? Is this a new Cold War coming or not? Is there a way to avert the advent of a new Cold War? And
Okay, well,
obviously,
let me speak for 10 minutes on that. Yeah.
yeah.
And the audience is Korean, is that right?
Oh yeah, we have a huge audience, and ministers are coming and etc. Is one of Busan City where the APEC meeting was held. Yeah,
I've been
in fact,
there. Yeah.
The Busan Metropolitan City is organizing the event with Hankyoreh daily newspaper. It is very well-known forum in Korea, along with Jeju Forum.
That's
That is
good.
one of the best forums in Korea.
Yeah.
We'll have a huge
Okay.
audience. Yeah.
So I'm looking primarily at a Korean audience. That's what I need to know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but it will be shared through the YouTube because it will be posted on YouTube.
Okay.
Then everywhere in the world they'll be looking at it. But anyhow, where primary concern is what the U.S. and then
Yeah.
U.S.-China relations, and then implications for the Asia-Pacific.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me get. So I'll speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll ask some Q&A. Okay.
Sure, yeah, that'll be wonderful.
I'll start now. Well, greetings to all of our friends in the Republic of Korea. I've been to Korea on many occasions. I've been to Busan on many occasions as well. It's a wonderful country, and I would commend the Korean people for having navigated the COVID crisis so effectively. We have followed these debates intensely in Australia. Of course, all of us as allies of the United States have been focused on the outcome of the US presidential elections. The fact that President Biden-elect is now on his way to forming the next administration as of the 20th of January is of profound significance to all of us. The American presidential outcome, of course, is only one part of the picture. The other part of the picture is Xi Jinping's China, where the Chinese leadership have just convened the 5th plenum of the 19th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And the critical question for America's Asian allies like the ROK, Japan, Australia and others is what now constitutes the foreign policy and security policy environment in which we will now be operating. And in the case of the ROK, what does it mean for the DPRK as well? I think the first thing to be said is that China's overall strategy towards the United States is unlikely to change. If you look carefully at the party plenum documents, but also the publications of China's principal strategic and foreign policy think tanks, China is preparing for what it describes as a sustained period of structural, systemic competition against the United States. Furthermore, it is doing so within a strategic framework where the Chinese system believes that there is a deep underlying shift and the balance of power between Washington and Beijing. And while Beijing does not say this overtly, that is why Beijing believes it has more freedom of policy maneuver than it did before. Tactically speaking, Xi Jinping's leadership will now go into a quiet period as they seek to understand the likely posture of the incoming Biden administration. That is important. Although for the period between now and the inauguration on the 20th of January, we will all need to be mindful of risks still in the South China Sea, the East China Sea and Taiwan arising from miscalculation on the part of both sides during this difficult period of the interregnum. But assuming there are no major crises during the interregnum, although they are possible, particularly if President Trump is providing uncertain leadership from the White House, I believe that the tactical pause in China's appreciation and analysis of the Biden administration will take us through until the middle part of 2021. On the American side of the equation, what will the Biden administration do differently? Number one, there is no distinction between Democrats and Republicans on the overall concept of China and the United States now entering a new period of strategic competition. There will therefore not be any magical return to the status quo ante in the US-China relationship, the point that it reached in 2016. And in large part, that's because Xi Jinping has changed the content, direction and tone of China's strategy and policy in the last 4 years. And as I said before, that's unlikely to change. Secondly, however, I think what was more likely to happen is that the Democrat administration under Biden and the Chinese are likely to reopen their military-to-military lines of communication. These have been effectively in abeyance for much of 2020 as the US-China relationship spiraled into disrepair. An effective military-to-military communications link is critical in terms of avoiding crisis management across the multiple flashpoints in East Asia. That's a significant advantage. On the trade relationship with Beijing, I do not believe a Biden administration will be able to significantly renegotiate the terms which Trump has agreed in his first phase trade agreement with the People's Republic of China. The Chinese will be doing what they can to ensure that they implement phase 1 of that agreement. But the prospects of what a phase 2 might look like under a Biden administration, well, that is a completely open question. Given that there is a protectionist base within the Democrat administration, this will be an area where I believe the United States administration in the future will continue to be hardline in its relationship with China. On the question of climate change, we are likely to see a reopening of strategic cooperation between Beijing and Washington. There is too much at stake in terms of the climate change agenda of the Biden administration to ignore China. We're also likely to see China, for its own national interest reasons, wanting to engage America in keeping the Paris Agreement alive. China's interest here is not sentimentality. China's interest here is driven by its own domestic analysis of the climate change science and China's own domestic vulnerabilities to radical environmental change brought about by rising temperature increases. So this will be a positive development in restabilizing the overall relationship. And my final point on US-China is that whereas the structural tensions, the structural competition, the systemic competition in the relationship will continue, it is probable that both sides will seek to prosecute that competitive relationship within the framework of overall strategic stability. And that is to have some rules of the road, some mutually recognized red lines in the relationship. My final point about North Korea is simply this. The Biden administration is likely to have a much tougher, rational, strategic view of Kim Jong-un's nuclear proliferation program. Most of the Biden administration foreign policy team have worked on the North Korean file in the past. They know and understand deeply the North Korean strategy of continuing to defer substantive actions in terms of the dismantling of the North Korean nuclear arsenal. And so you are likely to see a much more traditional, hardline, consistent, systematic US strategy on North Korea than we've seen under the Trump administration, which seems to have been more captured by the public relations dimensions of a president's ability to, quote, meet with the North Korean dictator, unquote, than with substantive outcomes on actual nuclear arms reduction and missile control regimes as it affects Pyongyang. And so that would be my overall remarks in terms of where we now find ourselves. And for democracies and like Australia and the Republic of Korea, for allies of the United States, like Australia and the Republic of Korea, together with our friends in Japan, we have a big new opportunity to work in a reinvigorated set of alliances with the United States on managing our common interests, managing our overall relationship with China, managing global economic recovery, and managing effective global climate change collaboration. I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you very much. That's a very impressive talk, and we Koreans will love your remarks. But what did you take on the American election? What is the future of democracy in the U.S.? President Trump is not accepting the defeat. How do you see that one? U.S. used to be the shining city on hill, but all of a sudden, American democracy seems to be faltering.
I think if we take a long historical view of the American democracy, there have been many untidy periods in the American democracy in the past. We could think of the end of the Nixon administration. We look at the multiple assassinations of United States presidents throughout its history. This is not a clean, pristine history. And frankly, none of our democracies have a clean, pristine history. Case of the ROK, you're a relatively new democracy. I'm old enough to remember the dictatorships of Park Chung-hee. I'm old enough to remember the dictatorships of Chun Doo-hwan and others. And the remarkable evolution in the Korean democracy in the period of the last 30 years or so. So in the United States, there is, however, a particular responsibility which you point to, because it has become the torchbearer of the global democratic project. And that is why, despite the enormous politicization of the campaign by, for example, the Murdoch media, by, for example, right-wing elements of the Republican Party, by, for example, right-wing, almost paramilitary operations, the core institutions of the American democracy continued to function. The state governments conducted the election. The count was conducted in a proper and rational and effective and timely way. To the point that we now have a lone voice effectively disputing elements of the outcome, and that is a defeated presidential candidate, Donald J. Trump. And so, has it been untidy? Yes, it's been untidy. But when we look beneath the surface, the core democratic institutions in the United States have proven to be strong. And I believe will continue to be proven to be strong until we see the inauguration on January 20. I wouldn't be surprised if even the president's strongest Republican supporters begin to fade away over the course of the next 2 months as the rest of the country moves on to working with and for a Biden presidency.
And do you think that the President-elect Joe Biden will be able to unite the United States and overcome the current polarization of American politics? I know it is very hard because it's really 50-50 divide in the United States.
Well, I do believe the world and some Americans are underestimating the capacity of the Biden presidency. I'll give you 2 names in recent American history, which you, my friend, will remember from your own scholarship and in some cases even our personal memory. One was the 2 underestimated previous vice presidents, Harry S. Truman and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Harry S. Truman, deeply underestimated when he was Vice President of the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yet in the period between 45 and 52, including his momentous decision to side with South Korea against the invasion from the north, he proved to be remarkable in his leadership in putting together the post-war international security architecture, in placing the doctrine of containment against the Soviet Union, and laying the foundations for the long Cold War against the Soviets, in which America ultimately prevailed. So he was much underestimated. Lyndon Baines Johnson on domestic policy in the United States, despite his external policy challenges in the Vietnam War, his internal challenges was to bring about 2 fundamental changes in American law, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And these transformed the future of African Americans. And from an unlikely source, namely a white Texan senator who had been part of the almost the good old boys club of the American Senate and the old Democratic Party of the South. And so therefore, the reason I say those 2 things is that we at our peril underestimate what Vice President Biden is capable of. His challenge is to actually rise to the occasion on both domestic and foreign policy simultaneously, to bring COVID under control, rebuild the American economy, and heal the racial divisions within the country, which are ultimately about equality and inequality, and simultaneously embrace a period of open, collaborative leadership of the United States with its alliance partners both in Asia and in Europe. My final point about the Biden presidency is this. Joe Biden has a remarkable ability to put together a very good team. And if I look at the likes of Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Michelle Flournoy, and others who are likely to occupy senior positions in this administration on the foreign policy and national security front, this is a formidable team, deeply experienced team, compared with those which President Trump was able to eventually cobble together for his own administration 4 years ago. Difficult, but they are intelligent enough and smart enough, my friend, to understand the dimensions of the challenge, the practical steps necessary to deal with the challenge, and the machinery of state which is essential to delivering on those answers.
You pointed out that regardless of the Democratic Party or Republican Party, overall anti-China sentiment in Washington is a matter of factness. Okay.
Yeah.
Then, is the new Cold War reality? I remember, Mike Gallagher, congressman from from Wisconsin once said that whether you like it or not, new Cold War is a reality. And Michael Pompeo has been championing this new Cold War idea. Do you buy that argument?
No, I don't, because it's not empirical. There's no evidence. And we should be careful about using language loosely. And as for Mike Pompeo, Mike has already been campaigning for the 2024 nomination for the Republican Party for a very long period of time. And the reason he called recently for the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party was, even though President Trump has never called for that, was to position himself as the new torchbearer of the hard right of the Republican Party as he campaigns for the nomination in 4 years' time. So let's discount politics from, on the one hand, from substantive foreign policy and security policy reality on the other. As you know, the Cold War 1.0, US-Soviet Union, had the following characteristics: mutually assured destruction through thermonuclear arsenals targeted at each other, and multiple nuclear crises. 2, third country proxy wars throughout Asia, Latin America, and Africa. 3, a rolling and raging ideological war between Soviet communism and democratic capitalism. 4, zero economic contact between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, pardon me for being empirical about this, but none of those factors apply to the current state of the US-China relationship. Yes, there are major structural, systemic tensions between the two of them, and there are widening ideological differences. But there are no third world proxy wars at this stage. There is not a rolling nuclear standoff between the two. And these two, the China and the United States, have massive levels of economic enmeshment in trade, to a lesser extent in foreign direct investment, but a common engagement in global capital markets totaling some $5 trillion annually. That's why I have chosen myself to call this Cold War 1.5. It's different. It's wrong to say that it's on an inevitable trajectory to Cold War 2.0. And the thing about Cold Wars like hot wars, my friend, is that they all can be avoided. We are not passive recipients to the determinist forces established in international relations or in domestic politics by an unnamed God, or Marx, or dialectical materialism or anything else. We are agents of political change, and we can choose, both in Beijing and Washington, to navigate this relationship differently. And I would urge Beijing and Washington to do so.
It's great to hear your very positive and optimistic remarks. But let's turn to the Korean Peninsula. You talked about, Tony Blinken is very experienced, the foreign policy expert. Susan Rice may come in. Funoi, she's very, very balanced. No first use, advocacy and etc. But overall, we Koreans are very much concerned that the Biden administration may return to old strategy patience of the Obama administration. What is your take on that one?
The truth is, we will not know the full content of the Biden administration's strategy on North Korea for some time, or on the Korean Peninsula more broadly. I do know, however, based on my knowledge of the individuals you've just referred to, and I've known them for a very long time, like you have, my friend, is that they are deeply realistic about Pyongyang, deeply realistic. They've seen all the North Korean strategies in the past. They are not convinced that Kim Jong-un is a force for change within either Korean politics, perhaps partly within the economy, but not really in terms of international strategic policy, or his determination to secure the long-term future, as he would see it, security of his regime by having a significant nuclear force of his own. So the analysis of Kim Jong-un and his regime on the part of the incoming Democrat administration is more likely to be consistent, hardline, and realist. Now, in terms of what they do by way of a policy response, I think we will need to wait and see, and I would not wish to prejudge that by any remarks that I make in this gathering. but there will be no romanticism about what Kim Jong-un's strategy is. And therefore, I also know, however, that the administration under Biden will have as its first instinct, not as its last instinct, to deal with Seoul like this in developing its policy and strategy towards the Korean Peninsula. And for South Korea as well, you're likely to have a much more normal, less adversarial relationship on the Korea-US trade relationship as well. So in overall terms, I think for Seoul, a Biden administration will be an effective partner. And if Seoul has particular strategic views about what's now necessary to achieve our common objective, which is the denuclearization of the North, then I'm sure the incoming Biden administration would welcome those views.
In your Economist column, you proposed the idea of M7, multilateral 7. And I agree with you in the sense that Washington, Beijing may not come up with a common ground to steer multilateralism and fair and just world order. Therefore, there need to be so-called injection by other actors in the world. But it is very interesting. You delete South Korea there, Japan, Australia, Canada, and even you said that if Boris Johnson changes his posture under U.S., United Kingdom may be included, but you never considered Republic of Korea. But now, on the one hand, you have been emphasizing Australia, Japan, South Korean cooperation. On the other hand, when you proposed M7, you excluded South Korea. What is in the background behind your proposal, and what should be the role of South Korea?
Well, I've always been a strong supporter of South Korea's role in, let's call it global middle power diplomacy. And for example, the small organization we call MICTA, Mexico, Indonesia, as well as South Korea, Turkey and Australia, was actually initiated at foreign ministers level by me in 2012, the first meeting of those MICTA foreign ministers at a meeting in Mexico convened by myself. MICTA as a term came the subsequent year in 2013. So for the historical record, you should understand I've always seen Korea within this frame. As for the article in The Economist, just regard that as editorial oversight, either on my part or on The Economist, I'm not sure which. I've always seen the ROK within this frame. What do I mean by an M7 or an M10? Let's call it what you will. And I've been talking extensively to the Democrats about their idea of a G10. Is a group of middle powers around the world, in Asia, in Europe and elsewhere, who are committed democracies, in large part allies of the United States, but who have this as their common strategic objective. In addition to our alliance obligations towards the Americans, it is to preserve, sustain and strengthen the fabric of the multilateral system anchored in the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. And I have argued this for a very long time. You see, great powers have a delusion. The delusion of great powers is that they can exist in the absence of an international rules-based order. For the rest of us as middle powers and as smaller powers, we have no such delusion. If you want a case study of why that is the case, look at the history of the Korean War. There, the United Nations acted under a resolution, and the United Nations forces, including Australian forces, entered the field to defend the South against the North. And so my argument about middle powers, like ROK, Japan, Australia, and the Europeans, and others, and I have not been prescriptive about the final list, by the way, just so that everyone's clear on that, is that we, those middle powers, 7 or 10, can quickly and flexibly, through the policy planning staffs of our respective foreign ministries, agree on detailed common strategies aimed at enhancing the legitimacy of the existing institutions of global governance, whether it's in the WTO on reforming the trade dispute mechanisms, whether it's in the UNFCCC on climate change outcomes now that we're 5 years after Paris, whether it is on international monetary policy collaboration, given the downstream problems which arrived from the COVID-induced recession and the IMF's leadership under Kristalina Georgieva, or on critical questions of international security, including cybersecurity and space. In other words, our common interest, as what I describe as the M7, M10, call it, or the G10, which is, I think, how the Americans are conceiving it as well, is creating a critical mass of policy, financial, diplomatic, and political capital among us to preserve the machinery of the global governance system, irrespective of whether we achieve a new equilibrium between China and the United States. We, you and us, Canberra and Seoul, we have a big interest in surviving the system. That is, in the system surviving. And so, but it won't happen just through speeches. It'll mean through the planning staff in Seoul and your good friends in Tokyo sometimes, and both your good friends in Canberra, but with the planning staffs in Berlin, in Paris, and in Brussels, and in London, and perhaps in Stockholm as well, and certainly in Ottawa, and maybe in Mexico City, working quickly and nimbly together with one objective: preserving the system, strengthening the system, refunding the system, particularly if it's bled of funding by future Republican administrations in the United States.
What did you take on Quad? And also, should South Korea join the Quad Plus? Because the idea of Quad can be contradictory with what you're proposing.
As you know, let's look at the structure of the post-war order. Post-war order is made up of two things. One, a balance of power, which has been anchored in US military power since 1945, and which the Chinese are now challenging, as the Soviet Union did before. And whether we like it or not, as realists in international relations, that underpins most, but not all, of what else happens in the international system. The second pillar of the post-war international order is the multilateral system. San Francisco Conference, the Bretton Woods Conference, the institutions that we've created. And so therefore, these two things have been in coexistence since 1945. And as allies of the United States, the ROK and Australia, we've operated within these two systems robustly. And therefore, my friend, we're going to have to just walk and chew gum. We can be effective allies of the United States in dealing with the challenges to alliance solidarity, dealing with the challenges of common security, which affect allies in both Asia, Europe, and elsewhere, against incoming security challenges. But secondly, we can at the same time be investing our diplomatic and political and financial resources and creativity into enhancing and sustaining and rebirthing the multilateral system. So we need to walk and chew gum. They may appear at one level to be contradictory, not necessarily so. As for the Quad, that's a matter for our friends in Seoul. I think you've probably got enough to preoccupy yourselves across the 38th parallel, but I'll leave that to more intelligent people in Seoul than myself. And as for the Quad, I'm of the view that a decade ago, when I was Prime Minister, there was a cool response, both by the then Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Abe's replacement, Fukuda-san in Tokyo, as well as in the United States, as well as then in Australia. So it did not proceed back then. The new strategic realities have invited a different response in the course of the last couple of years. But you know something? Effective long-term strategy in responding to China is not just a military strategy. It must be a multi-dimensional strategy, which also includes effective bilateral diplomacy with Beijing as well.
Therefore, are you suggesting South Korea join Quad Plus or not? Or to take time?
No, I'm being a diplomat and avoiding answering your question. And so, because that is a matter, frankly, for my friends in Seoul. And you will have a different strategic landscape, mindful of the particularities of the Korean Peninsula. as well as, let's call it, the wider dynamics of East Asian or Indo-Pacific security. And that is an acute balancing question for yourself. Look, for example, at the recent hardening of the position on the Quad in Delhi. That is direct product of what's happened on the Sino-Indian border. And now India has crossed the threshold of once having seen itself as an Indian Ocean power to now seeing itself as a country with a deep geostrategic interest in the Indo-Pacific. Now, Japan crossed that threshold quite some time ago in terms of its view of the Pacific, but was it to be an Indo-Pacific power? Well, increasingly it's moved in that direction. Australia, if you like, strategically over time has little alternative other than to see itself as an Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean power, because both oceans wash our shores. That's the hazard and the opportunity and the advantage of being a giant island like we are.
Finally, now I know that you have very busy schedule. Let me ask the final, question to you. Our friends in Pyongyang should be watching your, speech. What kind of advice would you give to the policymakers in North Korea with regard to Joe Biden? What kinds of behavior they should show?
Yeah, I've been to Pyongyang a few times over the years myself. I've not met Kim Jong-un, and I do not profess to be an expert on North Korean politics. I don't think anybody can profess to be an expert on North Korean politics because it's such an opaque business. But for the government in Pyongyang and the Korean Workers' Party and the Korean People's Army, the various elements of political power in Pyongyang, the baseline analysis they should have about the Biden administration is they will not be fooled by any North Korean tactic pretending to disarm. They will only be motivated by a North Korean decision to proceed to disarm. I think furthermore, the second piece of observations worth reflecting on is that Kim Jong-un over the last several years has been advantaged by a new dynamic with Pyongyang's relationship with Beijing. And that is, as Trump sought to normalize the relationship with Pyongyang, the result was that the pressure was removed from Xi Jinping and China to continue to apply pressure on North Korea to disarm its nuclear arsenal and to abandon its missile program. If Biden manages to restabilize the relationship with Beijing, and it's quite possible he will, one of the elements and the price of that will be China changing its posture to the DPRK. And therefore, for Pyongyang to assume that it will simply be a continuation of the previous relationship with Xi Jinping on nukes, I think is misplaced, because that will be front and center to Biden's approach to any restabilization or normalization of the relationship with the People's Republic of China. Those two factors, I think, should impact North Korean strategic thinking. Tactics, particularly tactics based on deception, will not wash with Biden's administration. They're too experienced. They've been doing this for too long for any of the old tactics to work, irrespective of the Hollywood dynamics of some of the things which have transpired more recently between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump.
Anyway, thank you very much, Prime Minister Rudd, and it was great, and it was extremely illuminating and enlightening to us. I again thank you very much on behalf of the organizing committees of this Busan Symposium. Thank you.
Well, my greetings also to the symposium, and my genuine well wishes to all of our friends in the ROK. Those of us who follow foreign policy carefully understand how complex and life and death your national security policy decisions are in Pyongyang. Your national security decisions are in Seoul and dealing with Pyongyang. And therefore, our thoughts are always with you, and our sense of solidarity is strong with you, given the challenges you face. You have many, many deep friends in Australia.
Thank you very much. I will do that. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye then.
네, 감사합니다. 현 정세에 대해서 굉장히
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very illuminating forum. And now we'll have some concluding remarks from Chairman Moon. Please welcome Chairman Moon back with a round of applause. I've been to many such forums like this, but this is the first time that I come in the that I appear in the opening ceremony and then come up on the stage again to open and close a forum. I'm making too many appearances today. But anyway, Prime Minister Rudd is a diplomat, was trained as a diplomat, and he's a fluent Chinese speaker, Mandarin speaker, and he studied and received his MBA, received his graduate thesis and master's degree in Beijing universities, and so he's very well trained as well experienced scholar and diplomat. And he served as the foreign minister as well as the prime minister of Australia. So he was. And listening to his speech again, I am impressed once again by how deeply knowledgeable he is on foreign affairs and international affairs. And to recap what he has been saying. When it comes to security issues or international security, that has been formed and stabilized through multilateralism, and also on the economic side. But this is changing, or is at the risk of destabilizing. So it is an urgent task for us to recover multilateralism, and we cannot leave it in the hands of the U.S. alone. Middle powers like Japan, Korea, Germany, EU, and even Mexico, all these middle power countries have to play their role to recover this international order as well as global governance that has been destabilized by the friction between the U.S. and China. And although he did not say this outright, the problem that we face and the challenge that we face is because we don't have such leadership right now. And one thing that I felt as I was talking to Mr. Rudd is that we cannot leave the international order and the global governance in the hands of China and U.S. We have to play our role, and we have to go back to the existing desirable international order, and that is the big message that this forum gave us. And the other thing was about our attitude towards both China and the DPRK. There was a strategy report by the Biden administration, starting with O'Brien, which stated that Marx-Leninism is the basis of China's strategy, and Cold War will be another ideological conflict between China and the United States. So it'll be a Cold War because it's an ideological warfare, and And the other comment that was made in the report is that there is countless Chinese scholars as well as students who are studying in the United States, and they are stealing American technology. And then from the legal side, the comment about China was that China is aiming to become the global hegemony. And then Michael Pompeo on the 23rd of July made a very important milestone speech that declared Cold War version 2.0. He said that China, the Communist Party in China, was responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. The Communist Party in China is suppressing and oppressing the Chinese people and only serving the interests of the party and not the people. And it wants to rule, dominate the whole world. And China wants to be the force of change over the whole world. So we have to make the preemptive move and crush the PRC Communist Party. And all the democratic forces in the world have to join hands. And Pompeo did not call Xi Jinping the president of China, but just said that he was called him the head of the Communist Party of China. So there has to be a containment policy vis-a-vis China, and so that's the context out of which the Quad came out. Especially when in the Republican Party, there has to be a Quad, the Quad, which would be the Asian version of NATO. There are 4 countries: India, Japan, and Australia, and the U.S., of course. And then Quad Plus would include Korea, South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand. So this is what is being proposed. Mr. Kevin Rudd is a diplomat, has served as a diplomat. And although he did not say outright no, a no comment is almost like a no. And Australia is participating in the Quad. And the American relations with China is worsening, and nuclear friction and crisis is heightening. And there is a lot of pressure on South Korea to join this and that. What if we refuse? What if we reject? The thought was we accepted the pressure, and we've crumbled under pressure, and we deployed THAAD in Korea, and that was the start of friction with China. And then there's the issue of decoupling. If you just look at the Samsung mobile phones, the parts, the components a lot of it come from Japan and from China and Korea. We put everything together and design it. And then the end product is exported to Europe. So it's a trilateral effort. So the whole world is in one big supply chain. And Japan is refusing to be part of that and refusing to cooperate. It means that we should stop trading with China. But we can't afford to do that. Our dependency on our trade relations with China is huge. Compared to, it's bigger than our trade relations or trade volume with the United States and Japan combined. And our dependency, the dependency of our small business owners on the Chinese tourists, that's also quite huge. And if we cut off our ties altogether with China, then we can't afford to do that. It would be almost impossible and unimaginable. So that's the tight spot that we're in right now. And then there will be another forum on the technological alliance, the need for a technological alliance with China. And to sum up, what Mr. Rudd has been saying is that this kind of friction it has been escalated deliberately by Michael Pompeo, and that is for his own interest and for his party interest to become to become nominated as the torchbearer of the Republican right wing. He wants to highlight how he has contributed to the victory of the United States in Bahrain, as well as in the friction or the relations with vis-a-vis China. So I think the premise here is that unlike this kind of escalation of friction spearheaded by the likes of Mr. Michael Pompeo, the Biden administration will be a bit more moderate. But there is still the possibility that we will be pressured. South Korea might be pressured to make a choice between the United States or China. And so we have to we might be pressured to make a choice. So under the Biden administration, South Korea might be expected and pressured to choose clearly to be on the side of the United States. The way it was the same during the Park Geun-hye administration. And the Biden administration, when it starts its office, then there are so many people who in the Biden administration that will be very knowledgeable about North Korea. Which is a big difference between the Biden and Trump administration. Michael Pompeo does not know much about North Korea. Maybe Bolton a little bit, but then the others know. And then there's Alison Hooker, who was in the State Department, who might be the only person who is knowledgeable about the Korean Peninsula affairs. But then under the Biden administration, there will be so many experts on foreign affairs, on nuclear disarmament and denuclearization. So these three forces, these people, they will be arguing among themselves. And most of them are hardliners. They want denuclearization first before they lift sanctions. But now, when it comes to nuclear experts, although they do not acknowledge or accept, but they do recognize that North Korea is a nuclear power, so they're going for a more step-by-step approach. Under the Biden administration, that would be the possibility. So although we don't know for sure, we shouldn't be going ahead of ourselves. So we don't have to hurry and go to visit the United States right now, because the Biden administration is only just starting, and it hasn't even started to receive or the transfer of government affairs. So it's too early for us to visit or to say anything. But one thing is clear. We have William Perry, Robert Bellucci, George DeTroyne, Robert Carlin, all these pro-democrats who are senior diplomats and high-ranking officials who have experience with North Korea. And they have met with and have formed friendship with the current South Korean administration. So in Washington, there will be no problem, and there will be there are many people who will be a positive influence when it comes to forming policies vis-a-vis North Korea. But the problem is that we don't have any rights to vote for the American president, but we are under so much influence depending on who becomes the president, American president. And one thing that I do agree with, whether it's Marxism or dialectic materialism, we don't have to be passive recipients of the powers that be in the international order. We have a role to play. We have an influence to exert as middle powers. That's one thing that I really agree with. Finland Prime Minister, and also I had a similar forum on a similar issue with them. And this is the first time that I have seen such an articulate person who is so articulate on the affairs, diplomatic affairs with regarding the Korean Peninsula. There are a few people I want to thank.
And I appreciate this very meaningful session that we just had. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I also I appreciate the insights that you have provided on the U.S. presidential elections, and we look forward to the following discussions. I would like to thank the chairman and the former Prime Minister of Australia for their wonderful comments. Thank you very much. We will have a short break and reconvene at 11:30. I would like to ask all participants to be seated by 11:25. In the next session, we will invite two young scholars of Korea and the U.S., and they will engage in a panel discussion on the topic of conversions of geopolitics and high technology, future of the U.S.-China technology Cold War. We will meet you at 11:30. Thank you very much.